You've done so much great work building an amazing resume, and you've probably been applying for dozens or even hundreds of jobs, and now is your time to shine and get that job offer. But are you prepared for the big game? If not, you could find yourself back at square one, having to reapply and re-interview. What's worse is that some companies will not allow you to re-interview at their company for a period of up to 2 years if you don't pass your initial interview round. Now, I don't want that to happen to you, and I know that you don't want that to happen. So in this course, I'm going to teach you the best practices when interviewing and help you get that job the first time around. In this course, we'll start off by talking about the stages of the interview process, what the employer's looking for, and then we'll move on to talking about some of the good examples and not so good examples of an answer to an interview question. From there, I'll pass along some tips on how to properly prepare for your interview, and then I'll pass along some templates that are going to be super important and super useful to helping you succeed in the interview process. Then we'll go ahead and do a course wrap-up, and you'll be ready to succeed in your next interview and get that job that you're looking for. Before we dive into the course, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about me. I've spent roughly the last 20 years working in the technology space, and I've spent 12 of those years working as a leader. I function as an individual contributor in software development, software quality assurance, software release management, data, business intelligence, analytics, and a few other roles. During that time, I've been an individual contributor, but also I've functioned as a leader where I've been a manager, senior manager, a director, and a senior leader at startup companies, as well as at companies such as eBay, VMware, Amazon, and GameStop. The first part of the interview process is the initial phone screen. This initial phone screen is more than likely going to be conducted by an internal recruiter. However, sometimes at smaller companies, you will have a hiring manager or somebody else that is trusted on the team that's going to conduct the process. However, more times than not, it's going to be an internal recruiter that's going to handle this part of the process. After passing the initial phone screen, you'll be passed on to your first round interview. Now, your first round interview is probably going to be anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour long, and it's more than likely going to be with the hiring manager, although that's not always the case. Sometimes the hiring manager will have another member of the team perform the first interview, or if you're in a tech position, you might end up with a technical screening before you ever speak with anybody about the more detailed response questions and your background and experience. After passing the first round interview, you'll be moved on to the loop. Now, the loop is going to be anywhere from 3 people to 5 people that will be conducting your interviews. Now, don't worry, you're not going to meet with them all at the same time unless it's a special circumstance. But the way that most of these are conducted is that you'll meet with each interviewer one by one, and they will go through a set of questions for roughly anywhere from a half hour to an hour long interview process. During the interview is looking to understand if you can perform the duties of the job and if you can communicate and fit in well with the team. More specifically, they're looking at your communication skills as well as your experience, background, and scope of work that you've had in the past and how that might apply to this specific position that you're interviewing for. To deliver what the interviewer is looking for, you'll need to follow some best practice tips. First, you want to make sure that you use specific details and you have metrics about the accomplishments from the projects that you've worked on. Second, you want to talk about what you did and not what the team did. The interviewer wants to know about you and your accomplishments, not what everybody else did around you. Third, you'll need to structure your answers in the appropriate format, and this really depends on the type of interview question that you're being asked. If you're being asked an experience-based question, you're going to want to use the STAR format, and that STAR format stands for situation, task, action, and result. If your question is a scenario-based question, you're going to want to use a different format. The format that I like to use is to listen, confirm, inquire, determine, outline, and share. To properly prepare for your interview, you're going to want to follow these 6 key steps. First, you're going to want to take a quick look at that resume as a refresher. After refreshing your mind about all the projects that you've worked on, you're going to want to build out a project list. From this project list, the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to build out potential questions and answer them through the projects that you have on that project list. After that, you're going to review those answers that you provided to those hypothetical questions, and you're going to make sure that they adhere to the best practices using that STAR method if you're working with an experience-based question. Next, when you're satisfied with your questions and your responses, you're going to go ahead and practice that over and over again until you're perfect and you're polished. And last, you're going to want to repeat this process for follow-up questions. You're going to get follow-up questions and you want to make sure that you're fully prepared. Let's dive a little bit deeper into each one of these areas of preparation focus. When it comes to your resume, you want to take a quick look at that resume because anything on it is fair game for an interview question, but also your resume is going to help jog your memory for building out this project list. Now, the reason that you need to build a project list is because your resume doesn't have all the necessary details that you're going to want to talk about during the interview. The resume talks about the accomplishments that you've had, and it has some good metrics, but what it doesn't have is that situation, the task, or the actions on there. It only contains the results. After your mind has been refreshed with what's on your resume, the next thing that you're going to want to do is build out that project list. And again, you want to have a project list because you need that STAR format to be able to answer questions about your background and the experience and the context of which you're working within. From this project list, you'll look at hypothetical questions or potential questions that you'll be asked during the interview process. You'll look to that project list to try and pick off the project that you think is most important and relevant to the question being asked. For each of those questions in the project that you choose, you'll want to write out a detailed response. That way you can use this for practice and preparation for the actual interview. Now, I have a fair warning on this one. This does take quite a bit of effort to get right, but it is super critical that you go through this exercise. Otherwise, you will not be prepared properly for the interview, and it will most likely not result in success for you. After you're happy with that question answer list, the next thing that you're going to want to do is prepare. And you're going to go through and you're going to prepare probably multiple times doing this until you get it right, until it's polished. You don't want to memorize, but you do want to know how to answer those questions and have a good feel and have a very casual sounding interview when you're going through the interview process. The last thing is to prepare for those follow-up questions. You'll have about 5 minutes at the end of your interview, and you're going to be expected to ask follow-up questions. You're going to need a good follow-up question because there is a difference between a good question and a bad question, and it could potentially make or break your interview. So you want to make sure you're properly prepared, thinking of those great questions to ask, how to ask them, and following the best practices, which we'll talk more about in an upcoming section. This section probably gets people most excited because we're going to talk about an example of a question and a response. We're going to start off by talking about a question, and then I'm going to answer it with what I consider to be a poor response. From there, we're going to talk about why it's a poor response. That way you have the appropriate context and know how to make a good response. After that, I'm going to ask the same question, and then I'm going to answer it with a really good response. Then we'll talk about why it's a good response. Now, this information between the good response and the not so good response, that's going to give you the necessary information and context to understand how to think about the questions that you have and the examples that you're providing on your template. Let's get started with our question. Here's the question. Tell me about a time when you simplified a process. What was the situation and how did you make it better? Here's an example of what I would consider to be a poor response. Well, my manager wanted me to build a dashboard to support monthly reporting for the organization, and I didn't think that this would really solve the stakeholder problems because I anticipated that they'd have more questions, and this is really just based on like what they were seeing in the dashboard. So instead of just building the dashboard, I ended up building 3 dashboards, and it gave them the ability to drill down, kind of double click and find a bunch of details that they couldn't get before. So this is, me giving them self-service capabilities. And I decided to do this because, based on my experience, with Tableau, I knew how much data Tableau could handle. And we had like a few million records that we were dealing with. And so I knew that Tableau wasn't going to be performant and that maybe it would crash because I ran into this before where the database, Tableau would crash and it just wouldn't save right and things like that. So yeah, I didn't really want that to happen. And I knew that it would just cause problems. So I decided not to take that route and build the dashboard, as a single dashboard, or even putting like 3 tabs in it, because Tableau has this thing where it has these data sources, and if I put all the data in one data source, like that's the cause of the problem. So anyway, I just built 3 separate dashboards to do all this work. there was a deliverable deadline, so we wanted to get this done really quickly. Like my boss was really pushing me and said this is his top priority item. So I ended up building the first dashboard and getting that done. And then after I finished the first dashboard, I went back and I built the other two dashboards and shared them with the team. And I'd say that it was a success. Like everybody on the team said that they loved the dashboards. They didn't have any complaints. And, I was really happy that I was able to give them something that was super useful. So yeah, I'd call this a success. Okay, this is a really poor example of an interview response question. And here's the reasons why it is. So when it comes to the response, remember, we want to have the response in the STAR format. We want it to be situation, task, actions, and results. Now, in this example, the results were not clearly called out. The success metric of people being happy, that's not quantifiable. So were people really happy? Also, it's lacking a tremendous amount of details. There is missing context in terms of how much time it actually took to do the work, how many people were using the dashboards and things of that nature. And we don't really know why this project was being taken on in the first place. Also, it's really hard to tell. Did it take 3 months to develop this? Did it take a year? Did it take a week? We really don't know based on the way the answer was provided. Also, you notice in the example that I gave, I did a little bit of rambling in there. I went on a tangent talking about Tableau and some performance, and to somebody that's not familiar with that, they probably have no idea where the interviewee's response is going in a question like this. So anyway, you want to avoid kind of going down these rabbit holes, and this is why it's really important to write out your responses first and to practice them and be really concise what you're saying. Otherwise, it'll probably end up sounding painful, like the example that I gave to you, which, my apologies, I purposely made that sound painful and sorry to put you through that. So let's go ahead and let's move on to what I would consider to be a really good response. Let's start by going back to that question just to refresh your memory. Tell me about a time when you simplified a process. What was the situation and how did you make it better? I'd like to share an example of how I built deep dive self-service reporting capabilities from the ground up for our finance team. In this situation, I was hired onto the finance team in 2010. When I got there, there were no dashboards that were being used and all the reporting was being done in Excel. Now, one of our main reports, the Weekly Business Review report, the WBR, was one of these reports. Now, on this report, it had 12 tabs of information, with each of these tabs being provided by a different stakeholder. This WBR was being used by 23 different stakeholders, 2 of which were directors and 1 was a VP. Now, the issue was, not only was this in Excel and a lot of people were touching it, but the Excel document always had problems because team members were not always updating it properly. Somebody had to chase down the team members and make sure they got all their content in and had it done before the WBR meeting that we would have every Monday. And then the next issue that we had is because you had all these people kind of rushing around trying to get their data into this document, that it would frequently have issues with either data corruption issues or somebody accidentally deleting somebody else's data. Now, that caused a lot of delays to getting the WBR published, and it tended to upset the VPs and directors and caused a lot of stress and friction on the team, not to mention, at times, bad data being presented in these meetings that just caused a lot of lack of trust for the entire team, and then a lot of rework. I was originally tasked out by my manager to build a new dashboard in Tableau because he knew that it was going to get us away from Excel, and Tableau was this automated solution that we would be able to use. And it would also overcome some of those data issues that I talked about, because inside of Tableau, it's 100% automated. You don't have 12, 13 different people trying to make updates to a single document. So that was all great stuff. And he wanted me to keep the Excel view and port that same UI over into this new Tableau dashboard. However, based on my experience and knowledge of the business and observations in the WBR meetings, I recognized that his desired solution was not going to solve all the unspoken desires that the stakeholders had. So for example, in the WBR meeting, I observed that the directors would frequently have these, what I would say are these double click or deep dive questions about the high level aggregated information. So yes, we could port everything over to Excel, from Excel to Tableau, but if we did that, there was still going to be other questions and needs that needed to be addressed for the stakeholders. Now, why that's important is that it impacts the architecture. So if I am just thinking small and thinking about delivering that one component, the WBR dashboard, without thinking about the other pieces, at some point in the very near future, I'm going to get asked to re-architect things, and that will be a waste of time and efficiency and potentially open up the original dashboard to a bunch of bugs. So what I ended up doing here was tasking myself out to expand the scope and find a broader solution that was going to solve all the problems that the business had, not just the problems that were talked about at the surface level that my manager tasked me out on. So with these tasks at hand, I took the actions of researching the stakeholder needs and where I could obtain the data. Now, I went out and I partnered with each one of these 12 stakeholders to figure out how does their tab on the Excel document work, where are they getting their data from, what are some of the nuanced things that I need to know about in these calculations. Now, this was a really complex process, and it required me to learn and be curious and deep dive because this data was not centralized. What I found was that the stakeholders had to go out to dashboards upon dashboards upon dashboards to go collect this data and then manually input it or sometimes download it from those dashboards into the Excel document that we're talking about. So there was a lot of detail going on here, and it was further complicated because nobody seemed to know where a lot of the source data came from in those dashboards that I'm talking about here. How so? Well, the company had layoffs and there was no documentation within the company on any of this stuff. So if you found the dashboard, you'd have to break the dashboard open, find the data source, then go hunt down the data and get permissions and all this other stuff. So it was a really challenging process to move quickly on. Now, knowing this, what I decided to do is to break things out into a phased rollout approach. That way I could deliver what my customer, my manager, and the VPs wanted, which is high-level reporting, and we could start working on each one of those tabs one at a time. And so I created the project plan, and I prioritized my project plan. From there, I started working through each one of those tabs and building that dashboard component out into Tableau. Now, as I finished one piece, QA'd it, I rolled it out to my customers, made sure they understood how to use it, and then I worked towards the next, and so forth until I completed the entire project. Knowing these challenges, I took ownership and created a project plan, a roadmap, where I built the dashboard in phases. And knowing that the project had to be delivered within 3 months, and there was probably a whole bunch of obstacles that I'm not able to forecast, like I don't know what I don't know, I wanted to make sure that I was delivering the right things and delivering something on time. So I was using bias for action in this case with my phased approach, where I worked through the most important tabs on the dashboard or the Excel document first to migrate them over to the dashboard. And as I got one component completed, what I ended up doing is rolling that out to the team, making sure they were good with it, and I moved on to the next part. As a result, I was able to deliver results by building a Tableau version of the dashboard where I invented and simplified a process of delivering a 100% automated solution that moved us away from Excel. Now, the entire project was delivered in 3 months, but I had phase 1 of the project delivered within the first month, and then as a follow-up, I delivered my extended scope work of 2 deep dive dashboards that provided the self-service capabilities to 23 members of the team. Now, the WBR dashboard component, that was my phase 1. That was completed, and it saved the company 0.45 FTEs in efficiency gains. And that was achieved because, remember, we had those 12 individuals that had to update all those tabs manually. They no longer had to do that. Now, I also estimated that another 0.25 FTE was saved through simplifying the inefficiencies that were in the process. Now, these inefficiencies were due to the team members not being able to complete their work on time, breaking each other's tabs, and then just the general communication that goes along with that. Now, when it comes to the deep dive dashboards and the results of those, well, those have been used on a daily basis. And when I looked at the results, there was an average of 18 of the 23 team members are using them every day in the company. Now, another thing that I was able to do is take additional ownership and provide documentation. As I mentioned in the initial part of the process, there was no documentation that existed, and it ended up taking me 6 weeks to track down all this data and the data sources for all the data that was going into Excel. And this would have been a heck of a lot easier if somebody had documentation. So I'm guessing I'm not the only person that would have to look at this information at some point in the future. So I insisted on the highest standards here, went and performed the documentation and delivered that along with the total of 3 dashboards that I delivered to the team for this Tableau project. Now, to support all this work of the 3 dashboards, I ended up building 26 tables in our database as part of the process, and I am the owner of those ETL jobs that feed those database tables as well as the database tables themselves. Okay, so why does this work? Well, first, the candidate started off responding to this question by saying, here's a summary of what I'm going to tell you. Now, this prepares the interviewer's mind to say, oh, I know roughly where this story might be going, right? They're not caught off in left field where somebody starts diving into the process and you're wondering, are they going to tell me how to bake a cake or are they going to tell me how to write a piece of software? Like, I'm not exactly sure. So that's a great starting point. The second thing is the interview candidate explicitly used the STAR format and called out the elements of the STAR format by starting their sentences with the situation, the actions that I took, I was tasked, or my manager tasked, and the results were, right? Those are the specific language that you want to use as you're framing up your answer and speaking to the interviewer. You don't want your interviewer to kind of have to chase down, is that what was going on, who was doing what? Again, you're framing that out in their mind so they can write down in their notes, here's the situation, and then here's the task, the actions, and the results, because they probably have that framed out on what I'll call is a little template in their notepad, because they're looking to hear each of those elements as you talk through your story. So by doing that, the candidate made it really easy for the interviewer to take notes. Now, the third thing that I'm going to talk about here is there's a lot of detail. Obviously, that was considerably longer to talk through than the first example, which was a really quick response. And this is okay. The average STAR format answer is going to take anywhere from 2 minutes to 10 minutes for you to deliver properly. And it's super important because it explains what the candidate faced and then how they overcame some of those challenges and the details of decisions were being made, as well as the metrics and the accomplishments. And that's the fourth thing. The candidate used a lot of numbers in this example, talking about the number of people, the number of dashboards, the savings that was generated. These are all great things that help the interviewer to understand the scope of the project, as well as the impact or the accomplishments of that project. Now, the last thing that I'll touch on in this example is this is more of an Amazon-style interview, an interview question. So the STAR format, again, can be used at any company when it comes to experience-based questions. But in this one, the way that I answered it is I did inject a few of the leadership principles into my response to call those out to the interviewer on how I'm thinking about being an Amazonian and applying those leadership principles to my past bodies of work. So I think that's a really good example of what a candidate should think through. And if you're interviewing for Amazon, you definitely want to take a look at those leadership principles that are out there and understand them really well, understand how they work with each other and how they work against each other, because each one of those leadership principles can do that. They can work with one another or they can work against one another, and they're purposely designed that way. So if you fully understand those leadership principles and how they work, you can craft a really good response, and you can also answer a follow-up question that comes on the heels of that. So, for example, if somebody were to ask, why did you decide to build out this documentation? It sounds like the company doesn't care about documentation and it's not valued, so why would you bother putting in that effort to do it? And you might respond by saying, well, I consider that to raise the bar and insist on highest standards of the work that we're doing. Now, I made sure I delivered for the customer first, but fast follow on that, I delivered the documentation. And the reason that I did that is because I feel like a lot of people encounter this. On a daily basis, I encounter problem XYZ where there's no documentation, and it ends up costing me X amount of hours per day, per week when I encounter these. So we internally need to start raising the bar, and that's where I'm taking ownership to start putting out documentation and raise the bar on the quality of work that we do in this organization. Now, that would be a great follow-up response to help the interviewer understand why you did what you did. And that's a good example of just a follow-up anyway in some hypothetical questions that you may get asked during the interview process. Okay, that's it for this example. We're going to move on next to tips on how to interview and how to prepare for your interview. And we're going to get into things along the lines of your pre-interview, the day before the interview, as well as the day of the interview and what you want to focus on. In this section, we're going to talk about the tips for delivering a great interview performance. We'll start off by taking a look at the tips for the day before the interview, as well as what to do during the interview. And then we'll break down the what to do during the interview section into two components. One of them is how you will handle your responses and questions, and then the other part we'll talk about how to ask good questions. When preparing for your interview, it's really important to prepare for the day before as well as the day of the interview. When you have good day before preparation, it's really going to set you up for success. So what are some of the tips that you can do to prepare for the day before? Here's 9 things that I think are critical for success. 1, test your equipment. Make sure it's all working, and that way you won't have any hiccups during the interview process. 2, prep your environment. Make sure your environment is clean, it's organized, and it's ready to go. 3, don't over-prepare. Over-preparing could lead to more anxiety. 4th, review your resume. Anything on that resume is fair game for questions during the interview, so make sure you know what's listed. 5th, maintain a good diet. You don't want to have a situation where you overate and you're creating stomach problems or anything else like that, or when you're hungry and you're not getting good sleep because of it. 6, get a little bit of exercise. Don't overdo yourself, but a little bit of exercise is good for your body and it's going to help you sleep. 7, get some rest. It's really important that you get a good night's sleep. Don't try and overdo the sleep, but definitely don't get too little of sleep either. 8, put your phone down. Phones are distracting, they're addictive, they can disrupt sleep, so just make sure you put your phone down on a reasonable hour, and that's going to help ensure that you get that good night's sleep, which is going to help ensure that you're successful on the next day. 9, be confident and manifest success. Use things like a power pose and positive affirmations. These things are going to help you be successful for your interview the next day. On the day of your interview, you're going to want to prepare before the interview starts, and you're also going to want to have some great tips for when you're in the moment in your interview. To prepare before the day starts, here's 7 things that you want to focus on. First, get your day off to a great start. You know what makes you happy and healthy in the morning, so make sure you do those things to get your day off on the right foot. Second, manifest success. Again, the power pose, the positive affirmations, those things go a long way to being successful during your interview. Third, avoid potential distractions and other tasks that might come up. You don't want people interrupting you, causing you frustration, or asking you to take on additional tasks when your mind is supposed to be focused on the interview. Fourth, perform a quick refresher. Take a quick look at that project list, make sure you're prepared and you know what projects that you want to talk about. Fifth, put that phone on silent and put it out of sight. Those phones are distracting. Even if they're laying around, you might be tempted to look at it during the interview process, and that's not going to set you up for success. 6, prepare your desktop. Make sure that your desktop is nice and clean, it's well organized and great for taking notes. That way you don't have any distractions and you're not fumbling around for a pen or something like that. 7, control your environment. Make sure that you're not getting interruptions through doorbells ringing, things of that nature. Do whatever you can to make sure that it's a quiet, stress-free space that you're working within. On the day of the interview, you're going to want to follow these 10 tips to make sure that you're able to answer the questions in the way that the interviewer is looking for. First, listen actively. It's really important to hear the entire question that the interviewer is asking. Second, write that question down. It's really going to help and it's going to keep you out of trouble in case you forget it along the way. Third, recite that question back to the interviewer. This makes sure that you understand exactly what's being asked. Fourth, ask for clarification if needed. If you're not clear on what's being asked, better to clarify now than go down a rabbit hole for 10 minutes during the interview. Fifth, pause to collect your thoughts. It's really important that you gather those thoughts before you dive in and start talking about a response to the question that's being asked. 6, make notes of what you want to talk about. After collecting your thoughts, put a few bullet points down on paper. That way you won't forget about what's important to cover during your answer. 7, ask additional questions when required. Sometimes the interview wants to have a casual conversation and have a little bit of back and forth to see how well you communicate. 8, if you make a bad play or have a bad outing during your interview, it's okay. Shrug it off, get back in the game. Don't let it disrupt your entire interview. 9, if you have the right opportunity, you can sometimes redirect the question to something that's more favorable for you to speak on. And 10, show interest and passion for the position. Interviewers love to see that they have somebody that's really excited and wanting to work for the company. During the interview process, you're also going to be expected to ask questions to the interviewer. When you're doing that, I have 5 really important tips for you to focus on when asking questions. 1, you should always come prepared with a list of questions. Don't leave it up to chance when you're in the interview. 2, avoid filler or bad questions. There's certain questions that are perceived as bad, or they're just questions that don't really help. They're not going to set you off on the best foot and leave the interviewer with the best impression of who you really are. 3rd, be conscious of the interviewer's time. You may not have time to get to an in-depth question, so maybe avoid asking something that is going to result in a detailed response. 4th, be conscious of the audience that you're asking the question to. Questions about time off are not appropriate for somebody that is not the hiring manager. 5th, be prepared to answer your own interview question. Sometimes the interviewer likes to take your question and turn it back around you to see if you thought about an answer before you've asked the question. We're nearing the end of the course, but now we're at the most important part of the course, which is building out all of those great questions and responses that you need to be successful in the interview. Now, in this section, I'm going to talk about 2 templates that I like to use to help you get started. One of them is a very high-level project list that you'll use in an Amazon-style interview. But again, if you're not doing an Amazon style, you can morph this to something else. So I've used this at companies like Meta and many other companies that I've interviewed at the past to kind of structure what projects I might be able to talk about based on the core values of the company or the leadership principles of the company. And it's really a mapping file. That way I don't have to think too hard during the interview process. The second template that I'm going to pass along is for listing out all of the project lists or project items that you have that you might potentially want to think about when crafting your responses to these questions that you have, which is kind of the second part of this template that I'm going to show you, where we're going to have the questions and the responses. And you're going to copy paste the templated area. That way you can build out these question and response areas for your proper practice. So let's go ahead and dive into this. The first template that we're going to take a look at is my answer question template. This template's designed to help you capture all those interview questions that you might potentially see, and then log your responses to those questions, and that will give you the practice material that you need to be successful in your interview. So let's take a look at the first section on this template. On the first page here, we have the question bank, and this question bank has 3 subsections to it. The first one is for these straightforward questions. Questions like, tell me a little bit about yourself. These are common questions that you might see in an interview, and these are things that are not based on your experience, nor are they based on any sort of scenario. The next question that we have here is the experience-based question section. This one here is for things that are based on your real-world work experience, and you'll hear these come across as, tell me about a time when. And the next section that we have is the scenario-based section. This is not based on any of your prior work experience, and it's a scenario that the interviewer is going to pose to you regarding a hypothetical situation or an actual situation that they may have seen in the workplace. On page 2, we have a question-answer section where you're going to take those questions from the top and you're going to paste them one by one in here, and then you're going to write your response to those questions. This is going to help you prepare and make sure that you're being very clear and succinct about the answers that you're looking to provide. The third page that we have here is a template for those experience-based questions. And as you can see, we have the question at the top, and then we have the star-based format already stubbed out for you in template form, just to make sure that your memory is refreshed and you're ready to go, and you can fill this template out really quickly with the answers that you want to provide. Now on the left-hand side, I'm also calling out the project name and the company name. You can go ahead and populate that because that's going to help you during the process to recall the project that you want to talk about for specific questions that you receive. On the third page, you have those scenario-based questions. Since these are not answered in the STAR format, this is going to be answered a little bit differently, so there's not a project to list or company to call out here. It's just a section for you to go ahead and put some sort of response in. So what you'll do, you'll take one of those questions from the top, that hypothetical question, you'll put it in here, and then you'll go ahead and you'll craft a response. Now, because these are not based on real-world work experience, these are going to take practice. You're just going to have to try and go through the methods of listening, confirming, inquiring, determine the relevancy, and then planning your response and then sharing your findings. The more you practice this, the better at it you'll get if you get one of these questions during the interview. The next template that I want to share is my Amazon interview prep sheet. This is a high-level prep sheet for Amazon interviews, but you can also use it at other interviews. I've used this at places like Meta and other companies. I just fill in a little bit different information, but this is designed to help me recall specific projects that I might want to talk about. Now, the way that you use this sheet is if you look down at row 4 has Amazon's leadership principles listed there. And below that are the projects that go along with the leadership principles. So the way that I use this template is I look at the leadership principle, and then I think back to all those projects that I wrote down on the previous template, and I figure out which project name do I want to put on here. And that way, if I get asked a question such as, give me an example when you had to deliver an important project under a tight deadline, well, that sounds like deliver results in column C4. If I get asked that question, I'm just going to quickly reference the project name, and that's my memory jogger to say, hey, let's talk about this project during the interview. And then hopefully all my muscle memory comes back to me, and I start reciting the project that I had previously planned for in the other template. Before we wrap up, I want to pass along some additional valuable information to you. You just completed my mini course on how to interview like a pro, and you learned some great information at a high level. If you want to increase your chances of success, I highly recommend taking my full course on how to interview like a pro. In that course, you're going to dive deep into some additional details on the how behind some of the things that we weren't able to cover, such as how do you ask a really good question and what are some examples of really good questions to ask the interviewer. In the full version, you'll receive additional details and context on how you do certain things during the interview. For example, we talked about the importance of asking great questions, but didn't provide any examples of what some of those questions are. In the full course, I'll provide examples to those questions and more. Also, in the full course, you're going to get detailed questions in the question bank. This way, you don't have to go out and search the internet to find out what questions you might be asked during the interview. This is really helpful for speeding up your process of learning and practicing. The other thing to note about the question bank is a lot of the questions that I'll put in the question bank are questions that you might see during an Amazon interview, and those should help you get started as well. The last thing to offer to you is my one-on-one interview coaching prep. After taking the full course, I'm offering a 50% discount for you to take that course, and you'll get one-on-one coaching with me where we'll do mock interviews and you'll get immediate and instant feedback to help coach you up to success and make sure that you can land that job of your dreams. I hope that you'll join me for that full course. That way you can increase the chances of success during your next interview. Thanks so much for taking this course here today, and I hope that you make use of those templates and all the tips and tools to be successful in getting that dream job.